And we have to tilt toward doing things that are inconvenient, difficult, or even painful in order to try to restore the natural balance of dopamine in our brains, because we were wired for pain, we were wired to strive, we were wired for friction. We weren't wired for this world of convenience that we live in now.
A seguir, uma conversa com a doutora Anna Lembke, psiquiatra norte-americana com projeção internacional, reconhecida mundialmente por seu trabalho de pesquisa em opioides e medicina de adição. A doutora Lembke é professora na Universidade de Stanford, na Califórnia, é diretora do programa de medicina de adição e chefe de clínica de diagnóstico dual de medicina de adição da mesma universidade. A doutora é autora do livro Nação Tarja Preta e Nação Dopamina, ambos best-sellers publicados no Brasil pela editora Vestígio. Recentemente no Brasil, também pela mesma editora, Ana lançou o livro Workbook Nação Dopamina. Este é o Peter Cabral Podcast, sejam bem-vindos e agora, meus caros, deixo-vos com a doutora Anna Lembke.
So, Doctor, talking about Dopamine Nation, I'm holding your Portuguese version, translated version here of the book, Nação Dopamina, Dopamine Nation. Incredible book. You managed to, in a very accessible fashion, to tell and to dissect a very complex issue. And you managed to sort of envelop it in a storytelling fashion that's rather captivating. And, and before we actually start talking about the book and some of your work, I would also like to congratulate and say thank you to the folks that participated, particularly your patients, for the bravery that they have and the courage that they have. And obviously, they're sharing important information and sensitive information. You're a doctor, but we're the general public, and we're reading their experiences. And that's just so enriching, because you're able to capture all of that in such a heartfelt fashion. And us reading it, we feel it. We feel it in Dopamine Nation. We feel it in Drug Dealer MD, which is the other book that we'll also talk about during our conversation. Also the Portuguese translated version, Nação Tarja Preta, so Drug Dealer MD's version. So I would like to start with that. And then obviously I would like to congratulate you for all the work that you've done, all your contributions worldwide. We would also like to thank you for your time, for your having the ability to, or the availability to talk to us here today and share some of your knowledge with our community, and us just being able to have this one-on-one conversation and really get into the depth of your books. And I understand that there's a new version, or there's a follow-up version to Nação Dopamina, which I understand that contains some of your case studies, correct? Some of your notes on
right. It's an interactive workbook. So it's the Dopamine Nation Workbook. So it's for folks who want a more practical guide, working through how to prepare for the dopamine fast, and then what to expect, and then how to prepare for after the dopamine fast. Yeah. So let me just say thank you for your very kind words. It's been a great honor for me to be able to reach the Brazilian people. I've had so many wonderful emails, and I've now been to Brazil twice, been able to give talks. It's just been like a life-changing experience for me to be able to have these kinds of interactions and to learn about the Brazilian people and about Brazil. It's been really, an unexpected boon or joy from writing the books. And I also want to echo what you said about my patients who were so generously willing to share their very personal journeys of addiction and recovery for the book, so that other people could learn and benefit. And really, yes, that is such an incredible gift that they've given, and I feel deep gratitude to them also.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We're so encouraged by some of their experiences, and so It just, particularly in drug dealer MD, some of the stories and some of the experiences
Yes.
and the way that you build and narrate their personal experiences. And we'll talk about some of them later, but for example, Macy, it's just, I encourage the people that see our conversation or hear our conversation to really go out and get the book and read. There's no particular order. You can read Dopamine Nation first or Drug Dealer MD. In my opinion, there's no particular order. I don't know if you agree, Anna.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. Starting with Nação Dopamina, Dopamine Nation. I really wanted to ask you kindly to sort of talk a little bit about dopamine. I mean, we hear so much about dopamine, and obviously there's so much information nowadays accessible to everyone, and we hear it from all sorts of, verticals, whether it's a scientific sort of, approach, whether it's the more day-to-day didactic, approach, whether it's related with our natural triggers. I mean, we hear it in so many different contexts. And, you being with all your expertise with regards to opioids and all the work that you've done, and particularly, Dopamine Nation, I think would be really nice for you to start with explaining what dopamine is and the role of dopamine as a neurotransmitter, and exactly what inspired you to write or to stage dopamine as the center of your book, particularly talking about Dopamine Nation?
Yeah. Well, I think an important misconception out there to kind of dispel is that dopamine is somehow bad, or that we get addicted to dopamine. We don't actually get addicted to dopamine, and dopamine's not bad or good. It's fundamental to being able to appreciate what is reinforcing, rewarding, what is something that we should approach and explore. You can think of dopamine as a survival chemical, really, that we make in our brains that is fundamental to the experience of pleasure, reward, and motivation. And that has been central to our ability to stay alive on this planet Earth over millions of years of evolution in what has, for the most part, been a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, even though that's not the world that we live in today.
Absolutely.
What's that?
Absolutely, I understand that. We're not necessarily fighting for our lives, in a sort of a primitive savanna-like environment, but we're still subjected to some of the primordial sort of human, more animal limbic triggers, correct?
Right, exactly. And so dopamine is a chemical that we make in our brain. It is a neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitters are the molecules that bridge the gap between neurons. Neurons are the long spindly cells that conduct the electrical signals that make up the circuits that make up our thoughts, emotions, memories, you name it. But those neurons don't actually touch end to end. There's a little gap between them called the synapse, which allows which allows for fine-tuned control of those electrical circuits. So the presynaptic neuron will release a neurotransmitter that crosses that synaptic cleft, binds to a receptor on the postsynaptic neuron that either stimulates the postsynaptic neuron or inhibits that postsynaptic neuron. And that way, neurotransmitters allow for fine-tuned control of these electrical circuits. Dopamine has many different functions in the brain, but as I said before, one of its primary functions is to signal to us that the stimulus that we're receiving either from our own bodies or from the environment outside is important, necessary for survival, and something that we should approach and explore. The more dopamine that's released and the faster that it's released, the more powerful that signal that says approach, explore, and potentially get more of the same. So that's the role of dopamine in the brain. Dopamine is also very important for movement. It's probably no coincidence that the same neurotransmitter that's important for movement is also important for pleasure, reward, and motivation because most organisms need to move their bodies to get the rewards that they need to survive. For humans, that's no longer true. We can sit on our couch in our living room, swipe right, swipe left, and have it delivered to the doorstep, or for that matter, digital media is a drug. It can be delivered instantaneously to our phones. But the bottom line is that dopamine is a survival signal. It's an approach and consume signal, and it's kept us alive. The issue now is that this ancient wiring is mismatched for our modern ecosystem of overwhelming abundance.
Absolutely. Wonderful, wonderful explanation. You're really getting to great detail with all that sort of imbalance and the excess aspect of our modern daily lives and how that sort of comes together and really affects one from, let's just say, the primary purpose from, associated with dopamine, particularly when it's sort of like associated with the concept of the feel-good hormone, right? So when you have such a stage set for dopamine that I think that it's rather easily one to sort of not understand its actual role and understand that there's actually a very positive side to it. It's all about balance, as everything is in our daily lives. Am I correct? Do you agree with that?
Absolutely right. Dopamine is neither good nor bad. What becomes what can become bad is when we get out of balance with this signaling process, and recognizing that we really evolved to have to work very hard up front to get a little bit of reward. And we're now living in a time where we don't have to do any work at all, and we can get these very powerful, very potent, i.e. dopamine releasing substances and behaviors. And because of that, our brain is confused, right? It wasn't evolved for that kind of system, right? It was evolved really for scarce rewards and a lot of upfront work.
Very good. So, with regards to that, let's segue on to, how would we expand on precisely that intense and, let's just say, extreme in some cases, search for that dopamine hit, that dopamine sort of, pleasure reward and the personal gratification that's associated with that. How do we shift from that and find balance? And how does that relate to, or where do we, on a practical, very pragmatic sense, where do we face those challenges, or when do we face those challenges in our daily lives? For example, at work, or social, relationships, or intimate relationships, or career, personal, professional, academic development. I mean, all of these sort of avenues of human social experience that categorize our human social experience trigger dopamine rich reactions, and almost in all those circumstances we're prone to offsetting that scale, I believe, right? Whether it's at school as a student, or whether at work, or whether pursuing a career sort of advancement. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So what I contend is that almost every aspect of modern life has become drugified. And by that, I mean has been made more potent, so it releases more dopamine, been made more novel, been made more bountiful, and been made more accessible. And as a result, we're all more vulnerable to the problem of addiction, whereas, a generation or two ago and prior to that, really, there were the traditional intoxicants, alcohol, cannabis, opioids, stimulants, and they were reasonably hard to get, and they weren't all that potent, and only a subset, let's say 10 to 15% of the population, was at risk of becoming addicted to them. Now, all of those traditional drugs have been made much more potent, and we have drugs that didn't exist before because we've drugified all of human experience. We now have the internet. We have online pornography, online shopping, online gambling. We have video games. We have social media, which is the drugification of human connection. We've drugified our food supply with the addition of fat, salt, sugar, and other flavorants. We've drugified sports. We've drugified work. We've made it all more accessible, more potent, more reinforcing. We've quantified it and given it numbers. Dopamine seems very sensitive to numerification or quantification as well as to novelty. We can now easily get addicted to the news. My point being that it's everywhere, and all of us are struggling to some degree or another with the problem of compulsive overconsumption, such that the sense of otherness with addiction that used to be true is no longer really true. I think most of us can identify with over-consuming, whether it's food or digital media on our phones or really what have you. And therefore, when we think about how do we cultivate a healthy life in this world of drugification and overabundance, I think that, thinking about finding balance by finding the middle way, as Buddha talked about, Buddha tried asceticism, intermittent fasting and self-denial and self-abnegation in its various forms. And then Buddha tried indulgences in various ways and ultimately ended up promoting the middle way. But I would argue that in today's world of overabundance, Buddha's middle way is no longer working, that we actually have to intentionally avoid highly pleasurable stimuli, or at least use them in extreme moderation. And we have to tilt toward doing things that are inconvenient, difficult, or even painful in order to try to restore the natural balance of dopamine in our brains, because we were wired for pain, we were wired to strive, we were wired for friction. We weren't wired for this world of convenience that we live in now.
Perfect. Doctor, I was actually going to mention pain and the emotional experience associated with pain.
Right.
And would you say that, and you get into great detail in your book, Dopamine Nation, about this particular subject, but would you say that concerning or with respect to everything that you just, so clearly explained, you just painted a really good picture, a clear picture of what our modern, day-to-day life is, whether at work or school or relationships, the internet, the drugification of this and that, and just the natural exposure. It seems natural today. I mean, it's so hard to just, that's perhaps why the middle way is just not working, because, we're incredibly bombarded. We're just almost like infiltrated, exploited in a way. But I saw all sorts of agents, and some of them are alien to us. They're outside of our control and most of the time realm. Obviously, there's other things such as pornography and other things, or even food consumption and things like that are sort of like more within our range. But there are other triggers that sort of promote that sort of behavior. So would you say that, considering all of that, our resistance or tolerance, that's a better word for it, a better term for it, to the emotional experience of pain, has it diluted? Is it weaker? Is it more, let's just say that perhaps we're not as resilient, or we're not as motivated to endure pain or to sustain a way that brings a little bit of suffering, because we understand that our world now is pretty much measured between the realm of, pleasure, reward, and everything that we do is just centered or gravitates around the two sort of forces, the driving force of pleasure, reward. What do I have to do to get this? If I get this, how will I feel? And is it going to be good enough? Is it not? If not, I have to do it more. And just that sort of repetitive cyclic behavior that seems to be inflicting pain in all of us, I think, and it's certainly conditioning our behavior. But, would you say that the emotional experience of pain is affected by all of that in some way?
I think it's important to begin by validating that core to the way that the human brain is designed is the reflexive approaching pleasure and avoiding pain. That is so fundamental to how we are wired. And it makes complete sense, again, if we're conceptualizing like a subsistence level survival in a world where nature is conspiring against us. And if we don't continually seek out those natural rewards, food, clothing, shelter, finding a mate, and avoiding the imminent dangers, a lion chasing us, a hurricane, an earthquake, or just subsistence living, starvation, we're not going to make it, right? So it's just reflexive for us to approach pleasure and avoid pain. And we're constantly doing that at both a conscious and unconscious level. But the problem is because we have bioengineered a world in which we are so good at doing that, we are now relentlessly pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain. And we have all kinds of cultural tropes that encourage us to do that, that we are completely out of balance, right? Because the truth of the matter is that the relentless pursuit of pleasure actually leads to pain as the brain tries to counteract or get back into balance, get back to what we call homeostasis or baseline levels of dopamine firing. So we have this very difficult thing where we're wired to approach pleasure and avoid pain. We have cultural tropes and narratives telling us we should do that, and that if we're experiencing pain, something's wrong with our life. We should go to see a psychiatrist and take a pill, or change our spouse, or change our job, or move to a different area, or take some drugs, or whatever. But at the same time, really, we were meant to have quite a lot of friction and pain in our lives. And if that's not there, we are quite miserable. So we have to act against our instincts, is what I'm trying to say, in order to be healthy in the modern world. And that's very difficult to do.
So, okay, perfect. I agree with that. And I think that, I mean, you hear a lot of, words such as, resiliency, anti-fragility. But at the end of the day, I mean, it's just built into our own, I would say, our makeup as human beings. I think that, when we have an opportunity or a challenge is always an opportunity. And there's always growth. And I really like to say that. And there's tremendous literature, and I see that, I read that, in between the lines of what you just said, and, and results as a result of reading your work as well, that, we should embrace the challenge. We should embrace the fact that we're getting a little bit out of our comfort zone, and we're perhaps suffering a little bit, sort of, quote unquote, but we're being human. There's a reward at the end of that trauma. There's growth after the stress, let's just say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Right. Okay. So pain, and we're talking about, the emotional experience of pain. And I think that this is just a great way to start talking about drug dealer MD. Again, the book Nação Tarja Preta, the Portuguese translated version, available here in the Brazilian market. And when we talk about the book, I believe it, I mean, we in the very beginning of our conversation, we talked about some of the experiences that you were able to share and bring to us, and just structure a wonderful storytelling sort of narrative as you sort of go through all of their experiences, and we just learn so much by it, and it's just impossible not to relate directly or indirectly with one particular story or experience, because unfortunately, everything that you write about, it's just so close to us. It really is. And you're a friend or someone that you know, sometimes a relative. So what I was saying, that it's just unfortunate. Addiction and pain is so close to us, right? From all these different avenues. So I wanted to talk about start talking about our conversation about drug dealing. Do you talking a little bit about addiction? So the very same way, we started our Dopamine Nation discussion talking about dopamine. I wanted to start talking about Nação Tarja Preta, speaking particularly about addiction. Could you tell us, based on the work that you're doing at Stanford, you being obviously a leading opioid specialist, research specialist, could you tell us a little about addiction? Tell us, give us your view or about modern addiction to some of the, not only drugs, but in general.
Well, addiction today is conceptualized as a brain disease, and there's good evidence for that. The first piece of evidence is that we know from both animal studies and human brain imaging studies that when people expose their brains repeatedly to addictive substances and behaviors, there are observable brain changes in the reward pathway in terms of baseline levels of dopamine transmission. And essentially, people who are addicted will demonstrate in their brains below normal levels of dopamine transmission. So that's a very potent piece of evidence that addiction is in fact a brain disease. The other piece of evidence in support of conceptualizing addiction as a brain disease is that when we treat it as a disease in the healthcare system, that people have pretty good response rates. We see about 50% response rate when people actively engage in addiction treatment, which is about the same rate of response that we see when people are getting treatment for any other chronic relapsing or remitting disorder like type 2 diabetes or obesity or depression or anxiety. So that's sort of an indirect piece of proof, but again, I think it is compelling support for conceptualizing addiction as a brain disease and for building out an infrastructure within medicine to help treat people with addiction. Right now, in most of the world, including, frankly, in the United States still as well, a patient really can't show up in an emergency room and say, hey, I'm struggling with addiction, will you help me? And get a robust response. That simply still doesn't happen. There's enormous stigma. We still don't educate doctors and other healthcare providers about how to intervene for addiction. Oftentimes, insurance companies won't pay for that treatment. So we have yet to embrace the disease model of addiction, even though when you survey Americans, you find that the majority of Americans today believe that addiction is a brain disease and should be treated as such in the healthcare system. So in other words, we have a long way to go. And again, although there's still no brain scan or blood test to diagnose addiction, we still base the diagnosis on phenomenology, which is to say patterns of behavior that are very classic, that repeat themselves across cultures, countries, time periods, demographics. Someday we probably will have a blood test or a brain imaging to diagnose it. And in the meantime, we're better off treating it as a medical disorder than not.
We're actually going, so we're talking about, yes, there are certain difficulties today still to come up with diagnosis. Right. You can't just run a blood exam or this or that, or, right. And perhaps even your vital indicators or aren't necessarily good measurements for, that particular phenomena. But in fact, it is a serious problem, and that problem obviously leads to addictive behavior, right?
It can do, right. So, I mean, the brain is an organ, and like any other organ in the body, it can be diseased. It can have problems. It cannot function the way it's supposed to. And that's mental illness, right? When the brain is not functioning as intended or not functioning optimally. Now, what's interesting in today's culture is that in some ways we've sort of over pathologized much of human experience. On the one hand, it's very important to recognize that the brain can be diseased and that people can have bona fide mental health disorders. But on the other hand, what's happened is that even very minor distress is often now conceptualized as mental illness and in many instances treated with medication, because we have these cultural notions that people shouldn't be in pain or shouldn't experience suffering, and if they are, they must be mentally ill. And so, as humans will often do, we swing from one extreme to another. It would be good if we could land somewhere in the middle and not pathologize everyday life, accept suffering as a normal part of the human condition, and at the same time acknowledge that the brain is an organ and that mental illness is real, and that some people do need medications and other interventions to treat mental illness and save their lives. So again, trying to address the problem of over-prescribing psychotropics for things that are not actually mental illness, but are just the spectrum of normal human behavior, as well as validating that in some instances, psychiatric medications are not only advantageous, but potentially life-saving. So again, just trying to recalibrate around that.
Perfect. Indeed, and that's why reading some of the experiences from some of your patients is so important, because it really just illustrates, and I strongly recommend reading the book, because it illustrates the whole journey, whereas one is sort of develops an addiction, and sometimes even you develop an addiction while being treated. Macy, I recall, was that exact issue. She was being treated, and during your treatment for pain management, she ended up developing an addiction, and then the system sort of leaves you out when you're on a limb, and you sort of need to manage. And here you have a person that needs to carry on with her life. She's got a strong support system. Some of them don't. In this case, she did have a strong support system around her family and such, but some folks are just left on their own to manage, and we know that the outcome is not necessarily the greatest, unfortunately. You share a lot of data, you share a lot of numbers, concerning how folks in Medicare sort of get impacted directly and indirectly by some of these policies. Again, I strongly recommend the reading of the book. Obviously, you're describing the American system, but at the end of the day, I do believe that there is a tremendous resonance with and synergy with not only systems in Brazil and South America, but I would say worldwide. Because at the end of the day, you still have big pharma, you still have the pathology, and obviously the addiction and the human behavior. So the cocktail is pretty much the same. But I wanted to talk to you. There's a phenomenal plug in your book, and you talk about, which I really wanted to dissect a little bit. While you're telling the story of one of your patients, you mentioned that your patient had the need to take a stimulant in the morning, and then in the afternoon, obviously, for some pain management, your patient would take some analgesics, some opioids in the afternoon. And then in the evening, your patient would take some medical, marijuana. And then at night, to go to sleep, she would obviously, use or, utilize some medicine, sleeping medicine at night to fall asleep or to manage with, obviously, the experience, again, the emotional experience, you experience the pain, and unfortunately, we hear a lot of stories about that. Perhaps we don't hear it or we don't see it all sort of treaded in that particular sequential, logical fashion. but that's the practical aspect. And we all have seen or heard about experiences where some people utilize these drugs at different points of their life, and they end up complementing one with the other. And it just seems so easy to fall into that, trap of stimulant in the morning, analgesic in the afternoon, marijuana in the evening, and, sleeping medicine at nighttime. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I really think the key point here is that we've entered an era where many of us have come to rely on ingesting a chemical, right? Maybe a pill prescribed by a doctor or not prescribed by a doctor, or some other drug, or for that matter, doing some behavior to immediately change the way that we feel. And as a result, we begin to lose the capacity to just experience our feelings, to watch them come and go, to tolerate distress, to wait for an answer. And it's really changing our brains, changing our culture, changing the way that we even relate to one another. And I think this is, in general, headed in not a great direction, right? We just believe that if we're uncomfortable in any sense of the word, or not feeling what we want to feel in that moment, we should be able to take a pill or do something to change the way that we feel. It's really in many ways about control. We're really, in a way, addicted to control. And I think this permeates every aspect of our culture. It permeates political discourse. It permeates the way students learn. Yeah, I think it's really concerning.
Wonderful answer. I agree with you. It just, and I think we talked a little bit about that earlier during our conversation. Really, it's just so tough to get away from all of that. And obviously, yes, indeed. I mean, opioids, drugs, prescription drugs exist exactly for that. And it's all about control. It's all about balance. It's all about us as humans knowing how to resort to science and really just participate in a system where everything works, or everything should work to our own benefit.
Right.
It's not always the case. And in some of your cases, in some of your the experiences that you write in your book, you talk about situations where the addiction is so extreme, and that the system almost feels like, you ought to reject these individuals. So there's actually a term that you mentioned, which I wasn't familiar with, Dr. Pasek's term of opioid refugee, which I thought he was just phenomenal in the sense that really puts forth an image that we can all pretty much imagine and relate to and understand as we read your book. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So the term opioid refugees was coined to describe the phenomenon of patients who initially got their opioids from a doctor to treat pain. And as the dose escalated higher and higher, because that's what doctors did starting in the late 1990s and the first decade or so of this century up until about 2012, doctors just kept prescribing more and more opioids to their patients. And as they did that, opioid addiction went up, opioid overdose deaths went up. And at one point, the media and grassroots organizations and case reports and doctors started to say, hey, wait a minute, what's going on here? These folks are actually being harmed by the way that doctors are overprescribing opioids. And as soon as that happened, doctors started to pull back on opioid prescribing, which meant that, tens of thousands of individuals, if not many, many more, couldn't get the opioids that they had been getting with great reliability for many years. And so, of course, they started to go into withdrawal. They started to look for other cheaper sources. They started to go on the street and get heroin. That then led to a spike in heroin-related overdose deaths. And then fentanyl, especially illicit or illegal fentanyl, which is 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine, entered the illicit drug market. And then there was a huge spike in opioid overdose deaths because fentanyl is so lethal and so potent. So, you know, it's a slow turning ship in the effort to correct the original mistake of overprescribing opioids to patients with pain. The overcorrection actually initially led to more problems than it solved. This past year in the United States was the first time in, more than 20 years, I believe, that we saw a slight decrease in opioid-related overdose deaths. So from 1999 until, again, just about a year ago, every year, opioid-related overdose deaths increased in this country, a great tragedy. And I think I hope finally, we're starting to turn the corner.
Really, really good to hear that. Yes, I did come across some of those numbers during my research. Obviously, it's a really good indicator, but there's still so much more to get done. I understand, and I'm sure that you agree.
Yeah. Yes.
You know, in reading the book, it's just, there are certain sentiments that sort of, that you embrace, that you can't quite, they actually just grow exponentially as you continue to read the book, and mostly enhanced by your patient's experiences. You know, and one of the prevalent, conclusions, or something that one may draw just by reading the book, is that, there you had a system where, at the end of the day, in a very pragmatic or practical fashion, it was supposed to work where you have a patient that wants to feel good or to heal or to recover from an illness, and you have a doctor or a system, or before, pharmaceutical companies, or before, let's just say, some of the government programs, let's just say, that their role was to provide care, provide and cure, heal. At the end of the day, heal the individual. As we go through your book, some of the cases, some of the experiences, they start pointing in a direction where patients aren't always just patients, they're actually addicts, and they behave in certain ways as addicts, but they do that because we talked about the opioid refugee, principle just now. Right. So, you have to sort of understand that angle also, and understand, look at the root cause. And then you have a system, or particularly, let's just say doctors and the immediate engagement with a particular patient, where in certain instances, it just seems that, the honest thing to do at certain point is just to really release the patient or avoid the patient, or there just seems to be such a conundrum, a problem. It's sort of like a cyclic problem, because the patient is not necessarily someone that's looking only towards healing. They're actually looking to beat the system, to continue their daily functioning lives. And then you have a doctor that sometimes perhaps they're just not concerned about healing. They have other interests, and, drug dealer MD just shines, an incredible light in that particular sense. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about that, but that's sort of like, a prevalent, take that you capture while reading your book.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex conundrum. Addicts, or addict, is kind of a dirty word in medicine. Most doctors don't want to deal with addicts. A person with absolutely no personal or family history of addiction can get addicted to the very same pills their doctor is prescribing, whether it's an opioid for pain, a stimulant for ADHD, Xanax for anxiety. And so, our healthcare system can create addiction in our patients. And yet, once they become quote unquote addicts, we no longer want to deal with them. And this is the fundamental crime that has happened. We create the addiction. We,
Right.
the healthcare providers in the healthcare system, especially the monetization of healthcare happens through the objectification of patients as commodities. And yet, once we have created the problem of addiction, we wipe our hands of it. And this is where reframing all of this, reframing addiction as a disease is so important. Because once we reframe addiction as disease, instead of just treating these people like garbage and not caring for them, we say, hey, this was an unintended consequence of the care that we provided. I prescribed this stimulant to help with ADHD, but it looks like it's created a new problem. But fortunately, there's good treatment for addiction, and I know what it is, or I know somebody who knows how to deliver that treatment. So I'm going to refer this patient, or I'm going to care for this problem. I'm going to add it to the problem list. And I think that's really the key here, that there's this, and it's interesting because Richard Sackler, one of the founders of Purdue Pharma, the makers of OxyContin, which was ground zero for the American opioid epidemic, in the marketing campaign for OxyContin, explicitly wanted to make a distinction between so-called addicts and then real patients with pain. But the truth is there is no such distinction. Real patients with pain can develop real addiction to the opioids their doctors are prescribing. And again, what we need to do is use a medical model, enlist our compassion and our professionalism, and then offer treatment for that problem rather than just saying, oh, well, now that you're addicted, get out of my office.
Indeed, indeed. There are some lines in your book that are tremendous takeaways. And just to complement what we just talked about, you say that, drug dealers pretend to be doctors and an addict or pretends to be a patient. And that just paints a rather bleak picture of a system that's broken. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think at its worst, that's what happens. We create addiction in our patients, and we disavow what we've done. And at the same time, on some level, conscious or otherwise, we know we're disavowing it, and so that's moral injury. And that's why, we see huge burnout and a lot of people leaving medical practice because they know that the care that they're providing is not actually helping people. So the way to keep these wonderful, mostly well-intentioned, not all, but mostly well-intentioned, mostly well-educated physicians and other healthcare providers in the field of medicine is to create a structure to allow them to deliver the kind of care that will actually make them feel good about themselves as healers.
That's exactly what I wanted to get into. Anna, thank you so much. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about your students. I mean, how do you deal with this today? When you talk about when you're lecturing, when you're going about and talking about your research, you as an expert on opioids, and a leading thinker and researcher with regards to this particular subject, and and obviously your books and everything that you've done. How do you do that?
Well, it's so interesting. Until about 2010, there were almost no medical students or residents or colleagues who were interested in learning more about addiction and how to treat it. But starting around 2010, there was a real paradigm shift because of, I think, the opioid epidemic. And this is, in a way, the silver lining of that tragedy is that it really made the medical community stand up and say, hey, wait a minute, we're causing this problem. We also need to provide some solutions. And now I've got all kinds of young people from all different backgrounds who are really eager to learn about how to treat addiction, how to help people with addiction. There are some amazing statistics in the United States. There's hardly anybody in the U.S. now who hasn't either themselves struggled with addiction or knows somebody quite close to them who struggled with addiction. So this is, really come home for Americans, such that young people today are super motivated to learn about addiction, and young people in medicine in particular, which is really exciting. Now we have medical students who want to shadow in the clinic. We've started an addiction medicine fellowship where we've got young, junior doctors who want to spend an extra year learning how to treat addiction. And many of them are very mission driven in the sense that they have a family member or they have a close friend, who's been affected or who's died of a drug overdose. So therefore, it's a really, that's a really positive thing, and a big shift from when I first entered this field. And it was really just a bunch of, sidelined wounded warriors, very few of us treating addiction. And now it's really become much more popular, much more mainstream. It's a great change.
Wonderful. I was so hoping to hear that from you,
Yeah.
because that's just a very nice full circle for our conversation, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, we've made progress. We have really made progress. Yeah.
So that's wonderful. That's wonderful to hear that. I really wanted to hear that and see whether you feel that at the grassroots level, whether you see students getting engaged,
Oh, yeah.
vested in that particular
That's great.
subject,
Yeah.
because obviously interest drives research. Research drives obviously knowledge, body of work. Obviously, then you have access to funds and funding and all sorts of grants and this and that, and then
Right.
you have your chances of getting really good people to drive this subject and really getting engaged and bring in all other areas, not just the academic, but the technological, the political sphere, the independent sort of extra government, civil society, also very important to get engaged, get involved. So I'm very, very pleased to hear that.
I would just add, I've heard from, wonderful young physicians and young psychiatrists in Brazil too. I mean, this is a movement in Brazil. When I go to Brazil and I speak, there are a lot of young people in the audience. So people are really interested.
With that being said, and looking ahead, would you say that, to end on, a positive note or sort of like a bright note, is this something that you're looking into your future work, perhaps a new book, particularly driven or focused on that particular sort of avenue, the aftermath and what's really being done about not only managing, but sort of developing a new culture, a new property in terms of focus, destigmatize it a little bit? Would that be the focus of your future research or work or book or endeavor?
Well, I'm ultimately very optimistic about the future, and I do think that addiction is the modern plague, and that we will be grappling with this problem for the next several centuries, if not longer. But I also think that human beings have a remarkable capacity to adapt and problem solve. And so I'm very optimistic that we will figure this out. I wish I could time travel into the future and see exactly how we do it, but I'm quite certain we do solve this problem through a number of different, mechanisms: biological, psychological, social, spiritual. So I think we're going to get there, through our collective efforts, and I'm excited for that.
Right. Well, perhaps a great idea for your next book.
There you go.
Seems like just closing thoughts here. Wonderful conversation. I just feel that we've covered so much.
Yeah, thank you.
With regards to both of your books. We talked about your about to be published or just published book, follow-up to Dopamine Nation. So we're very pleased with all of that. We thank you dearly. And we
Yeah.
just, I always like to, as a writer, I like to ask the folks that I talk to, what's the perfect book? What is the perfect book? And what exactly the perfect book sort of inspires you to do or think about in terms of the experience? And these are really the closing thoughts. We thank you for your time, and we hope to have you again with us soon. And again, just congratulations on your phenomenal work. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so for me, the perfect book is a book that feels like an intimate conversation with somebody that you know and trust, who tells you something in that conversation that changes your life for the better.
That's a wonderful answer. Thank you so much,
You're
Doctor.
very welcome.
Truly
You're
a
very
pleasure to
welcome.
meet you. Truly a
Yes.
pleasure to talk to you. See you soon. Appreciate it.
Para fechamento e reflexão, faço questão de vos deixar com alguns números. Em pesquisa 2019, a Fiocruz revelou que 4,4 milhões de brasileiros já fizeram uso sem prescrição médica de algum tipo de opioide. Como perspectiva, o Portal Statista informa que no mesmo período o número de usuários de opioides nas Américas foi de 13,73 milhões. Em 2021, o número de usuários de opioides a nível mundial foi estimado em 60 milhões de pessoas.